I woke up on Wednesday with a sore throat, which is really not unusual when I'm on vacation. I don't know if anybody else in here can relate, but as a rule, my body gives itself permission to get sick every time I have a break. But when I stepped outside to grab coffee that morning, I knew that it wasn't a cold, even though Balboa Island, where I was staying, is 50 miles south of the Pacific Palisades. I could smell smoke in the air. And so before we left my uncle's house, we remade the guest rooms so that they would be ready for friends who'd been forced to evacuate their homes. And as our plane took off that afternoon, I looked north, a view that I've seen hundreds of times, towards Los Angeles, and the city was completely obscured by an ashen haze. There's been a quote circulating on social media which reads, "Climate change will manifest as a series of disasters viewed through phones with footage that gets closer and closer to where you live until you're the one filming it." And I was thinking about the photos my family and friends have been sending me of familiar landscapes devastated by fire. And even though I know climate change is no longer an abstract proposition, it's still shocking to see its effects so close to places that I know. It's hard to believe that it was only a little over a year ago that I was watching fires sweep through the hills and towns where I grew up in Hawaii. And now Los Angeles, the city where I went to college, where so many of my friends and family live, engulfed in flames. And so for the past few days, I've been sitting with this knot in my stomach of grief and anger and hopelessness and fear, feelings I know that are shared with so many people in this community who have been impacted by these fires, or by the hurricanes that tore through the south and southeast this past fall, or the floods that inundated towns across the Midwest last summer. And I know that none of you in this room or joining us online, are the people who need to be convinced of the dire consequences of anthropogenic climate change. Unfortunately, too many of those folks are occupying our halls of government. And there will be a time to advocate for change. And if they still refuse to listen, vote them out of office, because climate change denial should be an unequivocal disqualifier for office in the year 2025. But that time is not this moment as we're sitting here together on Shabbat. In this moment, I want to do two things. First, I want us to hold space for the very real feelings that are occupying our hearts right now. I want to recognize the sadness and the rage and the despair that fills the void left by everything we have already lost on this rapidly warming planet, and the losses that we are afraid will come. I want to extend comfort and care to anyone who is sitting Shiva right now for people and places that have been taken by a world on fire. Folks in our community who've had to evacuate. Someone on our staff who lost their childhood home. So I want you to be gentle with each other tonight. I want you to be a little kinder. I want you to hug with consent, just a little harder. And I also want us to pray for the shelter and safety for a Sukkot Shalom for everyone who is in need right now. And second, the second thing I want us to do is I want to talk about what we can do, what we must do when the obstacles we face have no quick or easy solution. I keep returning to the advice given to me by one of my teachers, Ruth Messenger, shortly after the presidential election of 2016, which she repeated again recently after this last presidential election. And she said, "We cannot retreat to the convenience of being overwhelmed. Despair is not a strategy." Despair is not a strategy. This has become one of my many mantras over these past few years, particularly when I have a hard time seeing the way out of this mess. It reminds me that we are a people who have persevered through countless difficulties, who have walked across barren wildernesses, traversed vast oceans, who have outlasted every tyrant and dictator and pharaoh who has sought to oppress us. Our stories help us remember that despair is not in our spiritual DNA. No, our inheritance is hope. So this week we finished reading the book of Genesis. It ends with the death of Joseph, who is 110 years old and has lived to see the birth of his great-grandchildren and the transformation of his family into a small people. His life was devoted to ensuring their safety, rescuing them from a devastating famine, and securing refuge for them in Egypt. And in the process, he not only saved his family, but the other tribes and nations who called that land home. And so on his deathbed, he calls his brothers to his side, and he says to them, "I am about to die. And one day, God will take notice and bring you from this place to the land that was promised to Abraham and Isaac and our father Jacob. And if that happens, pakod yivkod Elohim etchem, v'halitem et atzmotai mizeh. Promise me that when this happens, you will take my bones with you." And then Joseph dies. His body is embalmed and laid in a coffin and placed in a tomb somewhere in Egypt. So now Joseph's request might seem simple enough, right, to take his bones with them when they leave for that promised land. But considering where he leaves his brothers, it's an incredible statement of faith in the future that was promised to them, but they had no way of knowing whether it would come true or not. Their family was thriving in Egypt. They were safe and secure and well regarded by the ruling elite. There was no reason for them to leave for another land. And so our ancestors stay. They stay and they grow, and they become a people atzum v'rav, numerous and great. And after a few generations, our ancestors forget where Joseph had been laid to rest. So now the rabbis offer a couple accounts about this lapse in memory. Some say that his body remained in the royal tombs, but the people couldn't remember which coffin exactly was his. And so according to this telling, when it was time to depart, Moses walked into the royal tomb and said, "Joseph, Joseph, the time has come for God to redeem us." And so Joseph's coffin begins to shake, and that way they know where to find him. Other rabbis say that the Egyptians took his bones and placed him in a lead casket and sunk it into the Nile so that it could no longer be found. And according to this telling, Moses walks to the edge of the river and he places a metal plate inscribed with the words, "Arise, ox," into the water. And again he calls, "Joseph, Joseph, the time has come for God to redeem us," and this lead casket floats to the surface of the river. Or maybe our ancestors forgot where his grave was because they no longer cared or wanted to remember. The book of Exodus, which we'll be reading next week, opens with a Pharaoh coming to power who doesn't know Joseph or what he did for Egypt. To him, the Israelites are more foreigner than friend. And so fearful that they might become a fifth column that aids his enemies in a time of war, Pharaoh enslaves them. And thus begins 400 years of slavery, of oppression, and hard labor. And as generations were born in shackles, as memories of being a free people became history, became myth, the idea of redemption must have seemed impossible. The rabbis teach that our ancestors felt so despondent that husbands refused to have sex with their wives so that no more children would be born into misery. And so given this paucity of hope, why remember where Joseph was buried when, dead or alive, no Israelites would be leaving Egypt ever? Given all that had happened to them, looking at all that was happening around them, despair must have felt like the appropriate and possibly the only choice. So earlier today, before sundown, we marked the 10th of Tevet. This is a minor fast day, so no shame if you missed it. But this is a minor fast day that commemorates the beginning of Nebuchadnezzar's II's siege of Jerusalem, which culminated many months later with the destruction of the first temple in 587 BCE, and the collapse of the kingdom of Judea, and the Babylonian exile of the Judeans, aka us, the Jews. One of my teachers, Rabbi Michael Rosenberg, points out that this fast is unique among our fasts in that it marks the start of a tragedy rather than its end. Take the 17th of Tammuz, which is when Jerusalem's walls were breached, or the 9th of Av, the day the temple was destroyed. He wonders on this 10th of Tevet what the people of Jerusalem must have felt. Did they believe that they would be saved? Had they already given up? What exactly did they want us to commemorate by designating this day as a day to observe with a fast? So looking to the book of Eicha, the book of Lamentations, which describes this very siege, Rabbi Michael points to a verse in chapter 3. It teaches that even in tragedy, one should continue to work for a better tomorrow, should continue to believe in redemption. For ulai yesh tikva, perhaps there is hope. Now, writing many centuries after the events of the book of Lamentations, Rabbi Ami asks, wait, all of this and only perhaps? Yes, only perhaps, Rabbi Michael writes. Sometimes disasters simply cannot be averted. Sometimes it's just too late. Yet by marking the beginning of the tragedy, the 10th of Tevet asks us, even when we find ourselves in the midst of destruction, to seize the chances we might still have to change course, which is to say, hold hope, even if it's only for a perhaps. Like our ancestors, the cities that we live in are burning to the ground. But also like our ancestors, we cannot afford to abandon hope for the temptation, however understanding, of despair. We're probably not going to live to see the end to this climate crisis or many of the other problems that plague us at this moment. But I believe that there will be a generation who will stand on the other side of this mess and who will need our tools and our hard-earned wisdom and our courage to get there. That's the point of the stories we tell, isn't it? Each of us is called to be another link in the chain, transmitting this inheritance of hope, lador vador, from generation to generation. The rabbis teach that Miriam, a child born in Egypt, a child born into slavery, whose parents were among those Israelites who refused to have any more children, convinces them to have just one more. Ulai yesh tikva, she says, perhaps there is hope. And this child will be the one who shows us the way. And indeed, the next baby born to her parents is Moses. And when it comes time for the Israelites to leave Egypt, suddenly and impossibly being given the chance for redemption that they have dreamed of for so long, Moses remembers the promise that Joseph had enjoined upon his family and their descendants to bring his bones with them so that he might be buried in the promised land. And so Moses turns to the Israelites and he asks, where is this grave? And I imagine one person looking at the next and shrugging, wondering how anyone could remember something that's happened so long ago. And then suddenly from the crowd, an elderly woman emerges. The rabbis teach that she is Serach bat Asher, Joseph's niece, and she leads Moses to Joseph's grave. So I like to think that Serach was not actually 400 plus years old, which is impossibly old, even by biblical standards. It's very, very old. I like to think that Serach, like the village elder or the local shaman, was a role, an identity, and a purpose passed from one woman to the next, sister to sister, mother to daughter, generation to generation. And her job was to remember, and in her remembering, preserve hope that somehow, someday, the people would need to know where to find Joseph's bones so that they could fulfill their promise to him on their journey toward freedom, even when that future seemed impossible, even if other people had forgotten and given up. Hope may seem like a small act, and hope is certainly not sufficient for change, but in moments that demand despair, hope is a necessary precursor to all other actions. I believe that for all people, but particularly for us Jews, hope is not an option, it is an obligation. A few weeks ago, I was driving through Michigan and I passed a billboard on the side of the road that read, "Hope is a daily practice that saves my life." And I was driving too fast to see who paid for this message or why. But I decided to add it to my list of mantras right after despair is not a strategy. Despair is not a strategy. Hope is a daily practice that saves my life. Hope saves our lives. Hope will save lives of people we know and people we will never meet. It may be too late to avert some disasters, but hope is what ensures that there will be the tenacity and the courage to seize opportunities for change, to change the course of our future when they present themselves. The Jewish story is driven forward by people who, in dark times against all odds, held hope. People who took chances and worked for a better tomorrow, even if the likelihood of success was only perhaps. And that's what we can do right now. It's something all of us can do. There will be times when holding hope is easy, and there will be times when we must look to each other for support. There will be moments when we need to look back at our own stories and the stories of our ancestors to remember how we have persevered in the face of tragedy and loss. And when we feel like giving up, when despair begins to weigh heavy in our hearts, let us remember that hope is not only our inheritance, it is our purpose, and it is our blessing for ourselves, each other, and the entire world. Shabbat Shalom.